Hi and welcome to the Create a Freelance website in Laravel tutorial series. My name is Matt Presland. I'm a PHP and Laravel developer based in Brisbane, Australia. And I've been developing PHP applications for about 8 years and working with the Laravel framework for the last few. In this series we'll look at building a basic freelancing web application where clients can post jobs and freelancers can view and apply to jobs. This will be really helpful because the best way to learn about a new language or a new product or framework is to actually get hands-on and try and build something. So this project will introduce you to the Laravel framework, and we will explore the tools and packages that will help you get a project off the ground really quickly. In order to get the most out of this project, it's good to have an understanding of HTML and CSS. Also a good idea to know a little bit about database-driven websites, and really essential that you know at least a little bit about object-oriented PHP. We'll also be using MySQL, however Laravel abstracts that from us a little bit, and we'll have a look at how to implement our database models using Laravel. So who's going to benefit from this project? This is aimed, I guess, at people who have some experience in PHP, have some experience with developing for the web, but you haven't necessarily used a framework before, or you haven't seen Laravel before. So we're going to take your skills to the next step in a really practical way. Session 1 of this series is going to be looking at setting up our development environment. So we want to be able to work in the most efficient way and be able to access and test our application from our local machine. So we're going to need a few tools to do this. The first is our code editor. So I'm using a Mac and I use the application Coder 2 by Panic. Other options could include Visual Studio, PHP Storm, Brackets or Sublime. So they're all good alternatives. There's a huge range of code editors available, and a lot of them support PHP. We're also going to use the MAMP stack, so that will provide us on the Mac with an Apache server, a MySQL server, and as well as PHP. If you're using Windows or Linux, you can use WAMP or LAMP, which are the equivalents. Laravel also provides its own environment called Homestead. However, we're not going to look at that in this series. We're also going to use GitHub. So I've actually created a Git repository on GitHub. You can find it at mpresland/freelancehub, which is going to be the repository for this project. It's empty at the moment, but we're going to fill that up pretty quickly. In our second session, we will start adding things to our application. So we'll look at adding users, adding user roles, and adding user interface. So user roles are going to be important for this application because we're going to have two sorts of people using it. We're going to have clients who are posting work for freelancers to apply to, and we're going to have the freelancers. So they're going to have different needs from our application. So we're going to create user roles to help us manage this. In this session, we'll start getting into PHP in Laravel and how it's used. We'll also be looking at Laravel's eloquent object relation mapping, which is essentially where we're going to start looking at our databasing and how we're storing our data. And we'll also look at blade templating, which is what we're going to use to build out our user interface within our Laravel application. In the next session, session 3, we'll look at adding the functionality for clients to post their jobs to our application and also give them the ability to edit and delete those jobs. We'll also set up our marketplace, so basically a job board where we can display the listings that are available in the system. Again, we're going to look at PHP and Laravel. We'll use Laravel's eloquent ORM, and we'll also introduce a package from Laravel Collective called HTML Forms. And this is basically a package that lets us build HTML forms for Laravel really, really quickly. In the fourth session, we will start building out the Freelancer interface. So we'll allow freelancers to log in, view jobs, and apply to jobs, and we'll also give them some basic messaging tools to allow clients and freelancers to communicate about a job. Again, we'll use PHP and Laravel, Laravel's eloquent ORM, and Laravel Collective's HTML forms package. In the fifth session, we'll look at the important stuff about how to get this application off our Mac or off our system and publish it to the web. And there's a couple of good tools we'll use, including Git and Laravel Forge. We'll also look at tidying up our application, and there's a couple of bonus features that I'd like to show you if we have time in the series. So stay tuned, and we'll get into lesson 1 very shortly and get this application off the ground. Thanks. Okay guys, welcome to session 1, where we're going to start setting up our development environment to build our freelance application. As I mentioned in the introduction, I use a code editor called Coda, available from panic.com. You can use whatever code editor you like, as long as it supports PHP. Coda 2 is really good because it's a multi-language development tool. So again, available from panic.com. We also need another couple of tools pre-installed before we can really get underway. First one is Composer, which is a package manager for PHP. If you go to getcomposer.org, if you haven't used it before, and go to the download page, it's got some pretty straightforward instructions on how to install from the command line and how to make it available globally on your machine. Laravel also uses Node or NPM, which you can download from nodejs.org, and it's got basically an installer wizard that will take you through and help you get set up. We're also going to use MAMP Pro, which is the basically Mac OS, Apache, MySQL and PHP server. And the Pro version gives us a few tools that make it really easy to test our application as we go. So I've installed MAMP and I've installed Coda, and you can see my other projects are sitting here ready to go. So let's get into it and let's create a new project in Coda, and let's call it our Freelance Hub. The remote URL isn't going to work yet. We don't have anywhere to publish this at the moment, but our local URL I'm going to set as freelance.test, which we can actually set up in MAMP Pro when we're ready. The other important one here is the local root. So where are we going to store our files? If I go into, I'll just put it in documents here, and I'll create a new folder called Freelance, and we'll set that as our project home folder. I'm going to turn site indexing off. It's a good tool if you're working on your own small project, but when you download Laravel, it downloads a few thousand files, and this will slow you down a little bit. Across the top here, we've also got the option for source. So we're going to use source control on this project through Git, and here it gives us the option to clone a Git repository. So if we open up that, it asks for a repository URL and a password. So as I mentioned in the introduction video, I've actually set up a Git repository here called Freelance Hub on my GitHub account, and it's public, so you guys can download this as you wish. And it gives us the option here to clone with HTTPS, and here's the address. So we can copy that address, paste it straight into Coda here, and I'll put in my account password, which I don't think you'll need for a public repository. And it's going to do a quick transfer. We're going to set this to the origin, make sure we're on the master branch, and save our project. So if we open that project up now, you'll actually see we've got our Git repository here with a README, which is also the only file available in the GitHub project at the moment. So it's actually already cloned our project for us. So we now have full source control access in our project. It's as simple as that. Our next step, I guess, is to start getting our Laravel installation happening. So Coda has a built-in terminal for us. We just want to go to our local host. And now we can access Composer, which is going to be the tool we use to download and install Laravel. So I can just simply ask Composer to create a project for us. I'm just going to name it we want the Laravel project, and I'm just going to ask it to install it in a directory called install. Normally you would basically name that as your project, and it would just install it in this directory. However, we've already got a Git repository here because I showed you how to set it up. So we'll install it into an install directory, and then we'll just copy it out in a second. Now this may take 2 or 3 minutes, maybe 4 or 5, depending on your internet connection speed, how much memory you've got available on your Mac, those sort of things. So once this gets going, I'll pause the video and I will rejoin you again when it's done. So you can see it's just started installing there now. Okay, so our application has finished installing. You can see it's complete here, application key set successfully. If we have a look in our little file browser here, you'll see we've got an install directory and it's full of our new Laravel installation. Now, I don't necessarily want it in an install folder, so I'm just going to open with Finder here, and I'm simply going to copy all the files and paste them directly into our root directory there for the project. It is going to come up with an error saying that we've already got a readme.md from our GitHub, but we can just replace that. That's basically just a placeholder for the repository there. So it's going to copy those files for me relatively quickly. Okay, and once that's done, we no longer need this installation file, so I can just move that to the bin. If we go back to our project now, you'll see that it's actually all set up and ready to go. Okay, so we've now got a Laravel installation, but we can't actually view it yet. We need to set this up on our local host using MAMP. So if I go back to our MAMP Pro installation here, okay, so if we come across to our MAMP Pro interface here, we can actually set up our local host to serve our new application. So we just simply hit the Create New Host button. We'll give it the host of freelance.test. We just need to set our document root, which is going to be our freelance folder, and then the public folder within it. So that our application is going to be served from that public folder. So that's what we want to set for our host here. Now you don't need to, but while we're here, we are also given the option to create a database. So we know this application is going to need one, so we may as well do it while we're already in the interface here. I'm just going to call this Freelance, and we'll create a user here. I'll call it Freelance Hub. And I'm just going to give it the password Freelance Hub as well. And then we can go create host. And then we also need to hit save down the bottom here, and you'll see our servers start to restart here for us automatically. Okay, once that's done, we actually should be able to access our application. So if I use Firefox and go to freelance.test, okay, we're served with the Laravel welcome page. So we're actually looking at our application here. It doesn't do anything useful for us, but it's actually up and running. Okay, and these links just go to the documentation for Laravel. Laracasts is a service that has video tutorials and ideas that you can use, and there's a few other services listed there as well. But that's essentially the start of our Laravel application. Okay, now one thing we do need to set up before we can go much further is our environment. So in our file browser here, you'll see a file called .env, which stands for environment, and it just has some basic options about our application. So let's name our application Freelance Hub. Okay, you can include a space if you like, but any entry that has a space here must be quoted, like so. Okay, our app URL, we've got HTTP localhost. Well, we've actually set that to freelance.test. And our database here, we're not using Homestead. We named our database Freelance with the username of Freelance Hub, and our password was also Freelance Hub. Okay, there's other settings here for things like mail and different servers, but we don't need them at the moment. We can just save this file now and our database should be set up. But it would be really nice if we could test that right now. And we actually can. So Laravel builds in the ability to add user authentication, which we're going to use. And if we have a look at the database directory here, you'll see a migrations folder, and you'll see that it actually allows us to create a user table straight out of the box. Let's just clear our installation details here. From the command line, we have a tool known as Artisan. So Laravel markets itself as a framework for artisans. So they use this Artisan tool, okay, and it will allow us to do things like create controllers, create our models, and also manage our database migrations. So we've got a built-in migration here that's going to allow us to create a users table, and there's another one that manages password resets. And to set these up and test our database connection, we can just go PHP artisan migrate. And you'll see that the migration table was created successfully, and it's all done. If you wanted to have a look to see how this worked, we'll go to MAMP, and we can actually open PHP MyAdmin, and you'll see we've got a freelance database here with a migrations table, password resets table, and a user table, which is the one we just created. So our database is actually working as we expected. PHP Artisan, or Laravel's Artisan, will also allow us to automatically create the authentication framework. And we can do that by asking PHP Artisan to make Auth. And you'll see that it's included authentication scaffolding for us. If we were to go back to our application now and just refresh this page, you'll see we've now got a login button and a register button. So we should be able to go in here now and register. Create an account quickly. Okay, we can register. You can see it's already pre-filled my name. I've got an option to log out, and it's given us a login dashboard. So we've now got a fully functioning application that allows us to sign up and log in, and it actually uses our database connection all out of the box. So before you used a framework like Laravel, you would actually have a lot of boilerplate code you'd have to build in before you had this functionality. So essentially, in sort of the space of 5 or 10 minutes, we've actually gone from having nothing to using a few command line commands. So we used Composer to install Laravel. We then used Artisan to migrate our database and set our database up. And then we used PHP Artisan to make our authentication pages and scaffolding. And very quickly you can see that gave us quite a powerful little tool here. Now that we've got our environment set up, we've got everything installed, and we've got a running application, we should go back and think about our source control. So in our file browser here, we've got our source control tab, and you can see that we've added a lot of files since we last updated our repository. Now, we could go through and click the add button on each of these, but each of them is going to expand and show us the folders within and things, and it's actually quite lengthy. So you can also do it from the command line, and it's as simple as asking Git to add and then giving it the all option. Okay, and if we refresh our page here, you'll see it's added all the files, all the sub files, and it's ready to commit. So using the little tool here, we can go commit all changes, and you need to give it a commit message. So we'll just call it our initial Laravel installation. Hit commit. Okay, and then we can push our code to our repository. So you can see here it's pushing to origin. Shouldn't take too long, so that's all done. And if we go to, I've closed our GitHub account, but if we go back to GitHub, go into the Freelance hub, you'll see that all our code is already here, ready to go. So this is great for working with teams. You can all access the code at the same time. And for our project, we're actually going to use our Git repository to push to our live server. So we'll be able to deploy our code using this source control method here. That's going to be it for this lesson. Okay, so session 1 is done. We've looked at getting our development environment set up. We've got it set up in MAMP with our own host, freelance.test. And we're ready to go. So in the next session, we will start looking at building in user roles and looking at that user authentication again, because as we discussed, not all our users are going to be the same. We're going to have some users that are clients that want to post jobs, and we're going to have some users that are freelancers who are actually looking for those jobs and looking to apply to those jobs. So they're going to have different roles in the system, and we'll have a look at how we can build that in and provide them with the content that they're actually looking for. So stay tuned, and I will see you in the next session. Welcome back, guys. Welcome to session 2, where we're going to start playing with our user authentication and adding user roles for our clients and our freelancers to log in and access the tools that they need from our application. And this is the lesson where we're going to start looking at how PHP works within the Laravel framework, as well as how we can manage and interact with our database. Again, we're going to be looking at Laravel's Artisan tool, which is going to basically scaffold out some of these items for us. So I guess the first thing we need to do is create our roles. So create our client role and our freelancer role. And we're going to do that by building a new model for our system. And we're just going to simply call this model our role. In a bigger application, you may want to call it a user role or make it a little bit more complex so that you don't run into naming conflicts. But for our simple application, we can simply call it the basic role. Now, PHP will allow us, Artisan will allow us to make a new model, and we can simply call it role by using the make model command, giving it the name, and then by appending the -m, it will actually create the database migration file for us. So we're asking it here to create our model as well as our database migration. So if we hit enter, you'll see here the model has been created successfully, and we've also created the migration. So if we have a look in our database folder here, under migrations, you'll see this file here that it's referenced. Okay, create roles table. And if we open this up, this is how we're actually going to manage our database creation. So here you've got two functions, or it's start at the top, sorry. It says class create roles table, so it's very descriptive in what it's going to do, and it extends our migration, so our database migration. It gives you two methods already made. One of them is called up and one of them is called down. So if we're migrating up, okay, or upgrading, it will allow us to create our table here and enter our fields, and it also gives us the option down. So if somebody has to downgrade, we can tell it how to do it. So in this case, we're creating a table, so the opposite of that is going to be just to drop the table roles from our system. So in here I can customize the fields that we want to add. So I'm simply going to add a new field to the table. It's going to be a string, okay, and it's simply going to be name. So that's where we're going to be able to name our role. Now I always like to add in here a description field, because you never know where you're going to need to describe this role to somebody within the application. Now the description can be a little bit longer, so we're going to make it a medium text field. And all of these available fields are all listed very well in the Laravel documentation. You can add integers, decimals, booleans, dates, all those sort of things to your tables, the same as you would in MySQL, but we just have a very simple way of doing it here. We've just added a string and a medium text, and we can now simply save that file. What that will allow us to do is run this migration and actually build that in our database. So if we go back to our terminal and ask PHP Artisan to migrate, you'll see it has created our roles table. If we were to go back to our PHP MyAdmin, into our Freelance database, you'll see we've now got a roles table with an ID, a name, a description, and 2 date fields that are automatically handled by Laravel. So this is what we just did by running our migration. So it's very simple to add to your database and modify your database. Now normally in an application like this, or a CRUD application, you would then go and create a controller to allow you to create roles and edit roles and remove roles. But in our application, we're really only going to need 2 roles. So why don't we just pre-fill them into the database? Now one way would be to actually access the database and enter them ourselves. Well, the other option is to seed the database. And this means that when we publish this to our live server, it will automatically fill these in for us. So PHP Artisan has a command for you. You make a seeder, and we're simply going to call this seeder our role seeder. Okay, and it says seeder created successfully. If we then go into our seeds folder here, and we've got role seeder. Okay, so you can see when we get into this seeder file, it basically has a public function called run, and that's where we're going to do our work. What we need to do first though is import the new model we created. So all we need to do is say use app role. Okay, and that's going to import the functionality we need from our role model. Within this run method then, all we need to do is create our 2 roles, and that's as simple as saying Freelancer is a new role. Okay. Freelancer name we will set to Freelancer, and we can also set our description field here. Okay, we can just set something very simple like that. And then adding it to the database is as simple as saving that Freelancer, or calling the save command on that Freelancer. So we can do the exact same for our client. So I'm going to call it client name, simply going to be client. Okay, and we're simply clients posting jobs for freelancers. Again, all we now need to do is call save on our client object, and we're ready to go. So if we save that file now, all we need to do is go to this database seeder file here and copy the example to add the seeder to the seeding queue, if you like to call it that. So simply this call, we called it role seeder, and hit save. Okay, then we can simply use an artisan command, call it db, if I can spell, db seed. Okay, and you can see there it's seeded the role seeder. So if we were to go back to PHP and MyAdmin, and you don't have to do this every time, but just so you have an idea of what's going on. And if we hit browse on our roles category now, you'll see we've got here 2 roles, one freelancer, one client, and they've both got our description here. So this is really useful for seeding your database with things like roles and permissions and anything that you might need to actually get your application off the ground, so that when you install your application, all of this happens for you automatically. If you decide to change servers and install this, it's going to do all these seeding things for you. It's going to run all your database migrations so that the application's ready to go. Back in the old days of PHP, you'd write your application on your local host, you'd install it on the server, and then it wouldn't work because you'd have to go back and build your database in the background, pre-seed things like roles and permissions, and it was just a nightmare. So this is going to allow you to do it in a very, very simple way. Okay, now that we've created our roles, we need to actually use them. Currently they just stand by themselves and they don't actually do anything useful for us. So what we need to think about is, what is the relationship between our roles and our users? Okay, so our roles are going to have multiple users. We want multiple clients to be able to sign up and multiple freelancers to be able to sign up. In our simple application, we'll just restrict it so that basically somebody that signs up is either a client or a freelancer. Okay, so we're going to have a one-to-many type relationship here between our roles and our users. And it's very, very simple to set these up within Laravel. If we go to our app folder here, you'll see we've got our role and our user, and these are actually our models. So if we open up our user, you can see that it extends a class called Authenticable, which basically handles user authentication, and it's got a few things in here already set. If we have a look at our role model, you can see it's empty because we created it and we haven't really done anything with it at this point. What we can do though is set up our user relationship. Okay, so we decided that each role could potentially have multiple users. So we simply need to write a function, a public function, and we'll call it users. And within that function, we just simply need to return, if I can type, that this has many app user models. Okay, and it's as simple as that. We also need to specify in here the foreign key on our users table. So we need to create this foreign key so that we know how to find the users with this role. And the convention is to use the name of the model, so it's role, lowercase, underscore ID. In our user model, we can set up the relationship here. Okay, and we decided that this was going to be a one-to-many type relationship. So in this instance, a user belongs to a role. Okay, so we can create a method that simply returns the correct role. And we say that this model belongs to our app role model. Okay, and it's as simple as that. One thing we need to do though is in our role model, we said we were going to use a role ID on the user model. So we need to add this role ID column to the database. As we've discussed, the best way to do this is using a database migration. So we can simply ask PHP Artisan to make us a migration, and we just need to be descriptive in what we call it. So we're just going to say add role ID to users table. Okay, and it's created the migration. So if we go into our database migrations again, you'll see we've got the add role ID to user table. And this is where we then, look at our up and down methods. What are we going to do? Okay, and it's pre-filled in quite a fair bit here for us based on the name that we gave it. So we said add role to users table, and it's basically already given us the schema. So it's already set it up for us. So all we need to do here is add to the table an integer, okay, because our IDs in this application are just using basic integers. So we're going to add integer role ID. It's as simple as that. And here we simply drop our role ID. Okay. If we then migrate, okay, we can see we've add role ID to users table has been successful. And if you wanted to go into our database here, look at the users table, you'll see we've got a role ID integer set, which is perfect. So that's actually ready to go. So we're now able to associate our roles with our users within our application. But for us, we don't want to do this after the fact. We want to do it when our users actually register. So wouldn't it be good if we could put a drop down on our registration form here that actually allows the user to choose whether they are a client looking for freelancers or whether they're a freelancer looking for a job or a project. So let's have a look at how we might be able to actually do this. Okay, so we want to add our roles to this registration form. So we first need to understand, where does this form come from? If we want to edit it, we need to know how it comes about. So let's have a look and see what it's all about. So you can see here that by visiting freelance.test/register, we're getting this registration form. Now, Laravel is based on roots. Okay, so you have a folder here within your project called roots, with API roots, channel roots, console roots, and most importantly, the web roots direct file. And within here, you can actually map out all of the pages within your application. So you can see that when we hit the application with no directory or no parameters after it, we're returning a view called welcome. And that's basically this welcome screen that you see. So that's where that comes from. Here we've actually got our defined roots, but Laravel has used some different methods to actually define those roots. So we need to dig a little deeper. So what we can do is within our terminal, we can ask Artisan for a root list using the command php artisan root list. And what that will do is it will tell us what all our roots are. So you can see here, hitting the application basically returns a closure, which was that method we saw in here that basically returns a view. And then you've got more complicated ones here, like register. So if we get our register form, okay, it's calling a controller called register controller. Okay, so that's stored in app, HTTP controllers with auth, register controller, and it's calling the show registration form method on that controller. So if we go into app, HTTP, controllers, and auth, okay, you'll see we can find that register controller that it's referencing here. So let's see if we can find the show registration form method. If we open this file, you can see that it's got some imported functionality here. It's got a redirection. It's got a few things, including a validator, which is good, but it doesn't actually have our show registration form method. It imports the functionality from this Illuminate Foundation Auth registers users trait. Okay, and it tells you a little bit about it here. So this controller handles the registration of users as well as their validation and creation. By default, this controller uses a trait to provide this functionality without requiring any additional code. So if we want to be able to hijack this method or to overwrite this method, we should probably have a look at where it lives in that Illuminate Foundation and registers users trait. So in our file directory here, we can go down to the vendor folder, which is going to include or show you all the source files for all of the packages that you've imported with Composer. And by default, Laravel provides a lot, but it does give you a Laravel directory with framework, source, Illuminate. Okay, so once we're in this Illuminate folder, it was within Foundation and Auth, and you can see here we've got a registers users file, and this is actually the trait that is used. And within here, you'll see the very first item on the list here is a public function called show registration form, and all it does is returns a view in the Auth directory that's called register. So we're just going to simply copy that method and we're going to overwrite it within our registers controller here. Okay, so this should essentially provide the same functionality, but we're just able to add our roles to that view. Okay, so now that we've got our show registration form method here, which is going to extend the one that was provided out of the box, we need to add some functionality to get our roles to display on that registration form. And the first thing we need to consider is that this registration controller doesn't actually know anything about our roles. So here where we're importing classes, we need to ask it to use our app role model. Okay, and now it's available to us. The next thing we need to consider is that we need to pass our available roles to this auth register view. And Laravel makes this quite simple, and Laravel's eloquent database management makes it super simple. So the first thing we need to do is find out what roles we actually have in the database, and that's as simple as assigning a variable to what's returned from our role model, and we just need to call the all method on that role model, and that's going to return everything in our database in that roles table. To display it in a form, we really want to make this a select box, or you could make it a radio button, whatever you like. For simplicity today, I'm just going to make it a drop down, so a select box. So we need to know what options we have available. So the first thing we need to do, I guess, is create an array called role options that we're going to pass to our view. Okay, and we next need to check if we've actually got anything. Did we actually get any results from the roles? So if you haven't done the database seeding, you haven't put any values in the database, it's not actually going to get anything back. So the first thing we need to do is check that we've actually got some roles. So we want roles greater than or equal to 1. Okay, and if not, we need to return basically, or set an option. Call this options here, sorry. So role options, and we'll give it an ID of 0, and we'll basically say no roles found. Okay. Now that we know that we've got some roles, we need to loop through our roles and assign them to our role options array. So what we're going to do is basically a simple for each loop. So for each of our roles, as a role, okay, we're going to assign it to our role options array, and we'll basically set the array key as the role ID, and we'll set the value to our role name. And what this should do is build us an array that either has no roles found, or it has all of our roles with the associated IDs and names in it. Laravel now makes it really simple to pass this to our view. So all we need to do is say return view, and it's our auth register view. And we're going to add our data with role options and give it our array here. So with our role options array. And it's as simple as that. So our view now, this auth register view, is now going to have a variable available called role options, and that is going to be the array we've just generated here. So let's have a quick look at that view. So it's auth register, and our views are stored in the resources folder. Okay, so you can see here resources. If we go within that, you'll see views, and then you'll see this auth directory that's being referenced just here. So within auth, we've got this register file. If we open that up, it's basically an HTML file, or it's actually a blade file that we'll talk about a little bit later on. But essentially, we've got a blade file here that just loads our form and displays it to the user. So we need to decide where are we going to put our role. So if we look at our registration form, okay, where do we want the role? And I'm going to say we might put it under the email address. Okay, so we'll slot it in the middle here and see how we go. So if we have a look at the form, it's a bit hard because it's all a bit jumbled up here. But if we have a look, we've got our name field, name here, we've got our email field, and then we've got our password fields. So if I just copy our email field, okay, and we're going to make this the label for role. This can stay the same. We'll call this okay, it's got a dynamic field there for languages, but let's just call it role. Input is now going to change, so we need to get rid of this entire input. Okay, we're just going to make it quite simple. So there we've got the div that holds the control. Select. I'm going to add one little thing here just for formatting, so you can see all of the other fields have this class form control. So I'm just going to add that here just to format it the same. The name of this field is going to be role. Okay, and now we need to pre-fill in our options here. Now the Blade templating engine has sort of a shorthand to do some items that you might do in PHP without actually opening PHP. And one of them is a for each. So we can do a for each loop within Blade. However, it's probably best for us to again check that we've actually got values within our role options array. So we can go @if, and then we can do a count. And if it's greater than or equal to 1, we want to proceed. Now you don't need any curly braces. Okay, and we have to go end if when we finish our statement. We can now do our for each loop. So for each of our role options as a role, and again there's no curly braces, so we go end for each. We want to create an option the value of that option is going to be the role ID. Now, rather than doing what you would normally do and doing a PHP echo of the role ID, something similar to that, Blade actually has a built-in functionality here. If you do 2 curly braces, you can simply say role ID, and that will pre-fill it there for us. So we've got the option value, end our option, and the text we want to be our role name. Okay, so this is actually so we've actually got an associative array. So we're going to break that down into the ID and the role. So this one here simply be ID. Okay, and this is going to be our role. And it's as simple as that. That should pre-fill a select for us. So if we go back and refresh this page, you can see that we've now got a role field with freelancer and client built in. So it's worked, which is fantastic. So we've added it to our form, but how do we now go about processing it and actually associating it with our user and things? So we're going to have to go back to our register controller, which actually handles the return from that form. And you can see here we're validating for name, we're validating for email, and validating for password. But I'm also going to say that our role is required and it should be an integer. And that's all we have to do. So we've added that to the validation. You'll see here that when the validator passes and we actually create our user, it's basically returning and creating the user all in one step. We need to do a little bit more work with our user. So let's create a user the old-fashioned way by asking for a new user. Okay, we'll then set the name, which is coming from data. Okay, so we're basically copying what they've done below. We're just recreating it so that we can add our own functionality. And so bear with me while I just get these done. So user, password. Okay, I'm just going to copy this because it's got our hashing. Okay. If we then save our user and return our user, we've actually then copied this functionality here. So they've done it short form, but I actually need to modify the user before we move on. So I'll get rid of this. We've created our user. We don't want to return him just yet. Okay, because what we need to do first is associate our role with that user. So up here we've imported our role, so it's accessible to us, which is fantastic. Okay, now with our relationships, we decided that a user was going to belong to a role. Okay, so we can actually remove this save method here. And we can actually save it through our role. So if we find our role using role find, and we just need to pass it the ID of our role, which we're going to get from data role. Okay, this role should now be the role that was selected by the user when they registered. Now Laravel's Eloquent provides us with the ability to add a user to this role with a simple method call. So if we call that users method, and we can ask it to save our user. Okay, this is going to do two things. It's going to save our user, and it's also going to assign it to the role. So we can hit save on that. Tidy up my code a bit. Okay, and let's see what happens when we actually register now. So I'll just refresh the page just in case. I'm going to register as a freelancer. So let's just give him the email at free@lancer.com. He's going to be a freelancer, and give him a quick password here, which is just secret if you're really interested. Okay, so we're logged in, and we're logged in as freelancer. But what does it look from a data perspective? So if we have a look at our users table and browse, you'll see freelancers being created here. If we scroll across, we've got a role ID here, and the role ID is 1. If you wanted to compare that, we could go and have a look at our roles table, and you'll see that the ID is 1. So quite simply, by combining our code here, we've essentially found our role, created our user, and then we've saved the user using our role model. So remember, in our role we defined this user method and said that a role has many users. So here we've said role users, save us another user, and it's done it all in the background for you automatically. So Laravel is helping you to manage those relationships without having to manually insert IDs and things, and it actually looks things up in the same way, which is really handy, and we'll get onto that very shortly. So now that we've created the ability to sign up as a freelancer or sign up as a client, we need to provide them with the tools that they need to get moving. And I think it's important that we customize our user interface to allow this to happen. So what I'm going to do is build a little bit of a contextual menu, or contextual might not be the right word, but a user-aware menu. So freelancers, when they sign in, for example, don't need to see a link to post a new job, because that's not what they're doing. They're here to search for jobs. Okay, whereas the clients do need to see that. So we need to be able to customize our menu based on that user role. And I mean, for an app like this, it's really not important to come up with a dynamic way to do that. You could just simply hard code it, but I always like to think about growth and moving your application forward. So I'm going to show you a way to build this in straight out of the box, so that later down the track, if you do end up having 100 different pages that a freelancer might have access to, we can manage it very easily within our application. In order to create our menu here to sort of handle user role specific items, we need a menu basically. So the way you handle things like this in Laravel is to make a controller. So I'm going to make a menu controller. So I'm going to ask PHP Artisan to make a controller, and I'm just going to call it menu controller. Okay, hit enter. It says controller created successfully. So if I go to our HTTP controllers, you'll see we have here a menu controller. And opening that up, here we go. So now we need to start adding our custom code to generate the menu. Okay, and it's fairly simple. So we're just going to make a public function here. And we're going to call it get user menu. Okay. And what we're going to do is return an array of menu items. So let's call it menu and create an empty array for it. Next, we need to know something about a user. In order to generate a menu for our user, we need to know who they are. So we need to import Laravel's user handling features. So Illuminate, support, and they have a facade called Auth. Okay, this is going to let us find out some information about our user. So we can really simply now go user equals auth, which we just imported, And basically our user equals our authenticated user. Fairly straightforward. First thing we need to know is, do we have a user? We don't want to display a menu if no user exists. So if our user is null, okay, we can actually reverse that. So if the user is not null, so we've actually had something returned, okay, let's give them access to home. Okay, let's let them look at a dashboard no matter who they are. Okay, we will populate the menu with a /home and we'll label it dashboard. Okay, fairly straightforward. So everyone's going to have access to that dashboard. What we need to do now is determine who the user belongs to. Okay, so we want to be able to do something like if user has role client. Okay, so if user has role client, we want to be able to add items to the menu. So similarly, we want to be able to do something like if user has role freelancer, we'll add something else to the menu. And it can be something as simple as post job. Okay, and we'll change these later because we haven't actually created these pages or routes yet. But just as an example, find job. Okay, they're the sorts of features we want to build into this menu. But at the moment, we can't actually query user has role, because if we have a look at our user model over here, okay, we don't have a has role method at this point. We've associated roles, but we haven't actually created the functionality to check our role based on the role name. So we can create a function here or a method called hasRole that we just referenced. We need to be passed basically the name of a role. Okay, and all we're going to do is a simple query of our database. So we're going to return null if we don't find anything. So this roles. Okay, so here we are referencing our relationship with our roles. Okay, so if this role where, and we want to search for the name, and the name is going to be passed in that role variable. And we're only interested in the first item it finds. If it's got it in there once, then the user has the role. You either have it or you don't. So returning null or returning if it finds this role. And it should be as simple as that. So we can query the user has the role client, or if it has the role freelancer, and it will add these items to the menu. And then all we really need to do now is return the menu. So our our menu controller now knows how to determine what links to provide, but how do we actually provide this to our front end? How do we get it into a view, or how do we actually make this into an actual menu that we can display to the user? So something like a menu, you want to pass to every single view that you load, because essentially every view is going to have a menu on it. So what we can do is, in our application or our app providers, we have an app service provider here. Okay, and we have this boot function. So we're going to modify this boot function so that every time our app boots, we're going to calculate what menu is required and display it to our view. Okay, so we're going to edit this boot function that basically fires off every time the application fires up. And what we want to do is hook into our view composer. Okay, so every time it composes a view, it's going to have a look at this this code we're writing now, and we want to apply this to all views. So you could specify a single view or whatever you wanted here, but essentially we've decided that our menu is going to be available to all views in our application. We can then just write a little bit of a closure here, pass in a view, or the view, sorry. What we're going to do is first generate our user menu. So our user menu is going to be you're going to do this the long way around here, unfortunately, because it's not preloading things. Okay, sorry, get user menu. Okay, so what we've done here is we've called our app, we've used the app method to call or find our controller, and we've called the get user menu method that we created on that. What we then do is we want to hijack our view again. So we access our view and we pass it the data. So we go with user menu, and then we're going to pass it that user menu data. Okay, close that off. So now every time the app loads, it's going to or every time a view is composed, it's going to hijack that, and before it loads the view, it's going to run our menu controllers get user menu method and pass that to our view in the variable user menu. So now what we need to do is actually implement this in our application. So we need to have a look at the way that this page is loaded and include a menu, and we're just going to look at putting it on the left hand side here. You could build it in the nav bar up here, but let's just have a quick look at how we could put it in here. And this is where we're going to start looking at Blade and the templating engine behind the application, or behind Laravel, and see how we can use it to our advantage and customize our application experience. So everything is built into this resources folder, and you'll see we've got a views directory in here, and we've got home.blade. So if we were to look at that root list we had before, sorry, over here. So if we ask PHP Artisan to list our roots, okay, home, and let's keep calling the home controller, and it's calling the index method on the home controller. So if you were to have a look at that home controller, when it loads here, home controller index is simply returning the view called home, which is this one here. Okay, and you can see here that it's extending the layouts.app layout. So if we go into layouts, we've got this app.blade. So this basically templates out the application, okay, and then this is your way of extending it and actually including your content within that template. So we don't want to do it on a page-by-page basis, which is what this home.blade represents. So every page we have, we're going to have a different view. So we don't really want to modify this, we want to modify the entire layout. And you'll see down here, we've got a main class py for yielding the content. So that's how that blade is working. It's basically including the content here. So you can see section content and end sections. Everything within those two commands is being inserted right here. So this is where we really want to build in our menu system or our page structure system. So this is our content. Okay, probably want to make a div here. Okay, and this is all pure Bootstrap templating. So we contain make a flex container, which is going to be the whole width of our screen. We then want to, I'm going to make 3 columns. We're going to make a left-hand menu bar, middle section for our content, and then we'll make a right-hand section for any details, messages, or anything that you might later want to put on the right-hand side of the content. And it's as simple as making a row. Again, this is all just Bootstrap. So make a class called row div. We're going to embed everything within this. So div class equals, and this is going to be a column, and we'll make it 3 units wide. That's going to be our menu. Then we want to insert our content into the middle column, so we'll make another column in here. Div class equals column. We'll make it 6 wide. This can all be changed later. Okay, remembering the Bootstrap template is based on 12 columns, so we've split that up fairly evenly, and then we can include our content within that center div. And here is where we want to work our magic and actually build our menu. So in our app service provider, we passed the variable user menu, which is going to be an array of everything that we've got. So the first thing we want to do is make sure we've got something in there. Okay. Sorry about that, silly code completion. So within Blade, if you want to add custom PHP, you open it with a PHP tag and close it with an end PHP tag. So within here we can simply write normal PHP, or we could do it using Blade syntax, whichever you prefer. In fact, why don't we do it using Blade syntax? So we simply go add if user menu, we want the count of that, count user menu, greater than or equal to 1, which it should be because we're adding the dashboard every time. Okay, don't forget the end if. So if we have more than one item in the menu, we want to loop through each, and we'll go for each user menu as menu item. You can simplify that if you wish, and we'll end for each. And all we're going to do in here is basically generate a list item. Okay, we're going to embed that within an href, so we're going to create our link, and the link address essentially is going to be the key that we pass to the array. So let's call it link menu item. So in here, we're going to use the Blade syntax and simply say link. Okay, the text of the list item is simply going to be the menu item. Again, using Blade. Close our list item, close our A. And we better wrap that in a UL. And that's essentially it, guys. So we've included that menu. We've actually changed the structure of this page. So we logged in as a freelancer. Let's see what happens when we reload the page. Okay, so we get a little menu here that says dashboard and find a job because we're logged in as a freelancer. If we were to log out and register as a client, okay, so client, Change that to client. Give him a password and register. We won't save that. You'll see he's got the option to post a job. So based on the role that this user has, we're generating that menu dynamically. And what that means is that anytime you want to change or add links or add routes to your application, you can do it based on the user's role, simply by adding links here. So we're logged in as a client at the moment, so let's add. Okay, we might want to add the functionality to edit a job, for example. Okay, save that. If I refresh the page, okay, we've added that to the client dashboard. Now, ideally, in a larger application, you wouldn't want to manually add these each time you added a route or added a page to your application. And you can actually make this database driven if you wish. And we may look at that in our last session if we've got time. Look at some of those extra features. And we might look at dynamically driving this this menu, but it's something that's a little bit advanced for this point in our tutorial. But at least now we've got a way that we can simply add our routes and our links necessary for our users to actually use the system. And we'll style this a little bit later on. I've already noticed that this middle column's maybe a little bit narrow, so we can actually change that here by we might make our sidebars 2 columns wide instead of 3, and that will allow us to make this 8 wide. And if we refresh that now, okay, now we've got more space for our actual content. But we'll look at styling that later. Essentially, we just need to know that we're able to create this and it's user specific. So that's going to be it for this lesson. And in the next session, we'll start building out the client functionality, allowing them to post jobs, edit jobs, and we'll make the marketplace page so that freelancers can actually view the jobs. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next lesson. Hey, and welcome back. This is session 3 of how to build a freelancing website in Laravel. So far, we've set up our development environment. We've got a nice, clean installation of Laravel. And we've also set up our Git repository. We've got a connection to our database, and we've set up user authentication as well as user roles for freelancers and for clients. In this session, we're going to have a look at building in the functionality for clients to sign in and post their jobs. And we'll also look at making a bit of a marketplace or a job board where we might be able to view the jobs that have been posted. So let's get into it. As with everything with Laravel, we're going to start our work today by using Artisan. And the first thing we need to do is define a model for our jobs. The way we're going to do it is by simply asking PHP Artisan to make us a model. And we're going to call the model job. Quite simple. We're also going to ask for a migration file by appending the little -m at the end there. And you see it's now created the create jobs table migration for us. So if we go into our database folder and into migrations, you'll see the create jobs table migration there. Okay, so now that we've got our empty migration file here, we can define the data we want to store for each of our jobs. So the most important thing, I guess, or the starting point, is we're going to need to be able to store a title for our job. So we'll create a string field. I'm just going to name it title. Next, we want our clients to be able to describe the job to our freelancers. There's no point freelancer applying for a job if they don't know what it's about and what's required of them. So we're probably going to need a bit of a longer description than the title. So let's make this a medium text field, and I'm just going to call it description. The next most important thing, I guess, is we need to be able to set a budget. So you're not going to hire a freelancer if you don't have a budget in mind. And a freelancer also needs to know what sort of budget you've got before they apply to a job. So let's create a decimal field here where our clients can specify their desired budget. Now with decimal fields, you also need to specify the precision. So here we've got 10 digits long, and we're going to hold it to 2 decimal places. And that's probably all we're going to need just at this point. We're making a really super simple little application here that's just going to store a basic job. If you wanted to expand this in your own project, you can simply add more fields here, and that'll be reflected in the database, and you can modify your application as you need to. But doing this is going to give you the basic concept and give us our freelance application. So if I save that file now and head back to our terminal, we can ask PHP Artisan to migrate that file for us. And you can see it's created our jobs table there for us. We're also going to need a controller. So Laravel is based on the model view controller sort of design principle or design pattern. So we've got our model. Now we need to create a controller, and then we'll jump into having a look at how we can build our views to actually input the data and view the data, edit the data, those sorts of things. So first we need our controller. So we'll ask PHP Artisan to make us a controller, and I'm simply going to call it jobs controller. Now normally it's that simple. If you had a controller in mind, we can actually make this a resource controller. So we're building an application that's going to follow the CRUD sort of methodology. So create, read, update, and delete. And Laravel basically gives us this resource option that's going to pre-fill out our controller to handle those sort of those common functions that we're going to need. So let's have a look at that now. Okay, so our controller's been created successfully. As with all our other controllers, we'll find them within our app folder. We'll find it within H. When you open this up, you'll see that by using Artisan, it's actually added a lot of functionality for us. It's added the important things we're going to need, like an index function where we're going to use, like basically have our landing page for jobs. We've got a create method there so that we can display things like our register form. We've got a store function where we can add the logic to actually insert our new job into the database. We've also got a show function that's going to let us pull the details out of the database, our new job into the database. We've also got a show function that's going to let us pull the details out of the database and put them into a view for our customers. We've also got the ability to edit, update, and destroy. So we've basically got our full CRUD functionality here ready to go. We just have to fill in the application logic, which is going to be fairly straightforward from here. So the first thing we're going to have to do, I guess, is create a landing page. So what are users going to see when they first come to our job section of the site? And that's going to come into the index function. So similar to a website, okay, the first thing users are going to see is the index. And all we're going to want to do here is simply return a view. And that's done by simply calling return view and specifying the name of the view. And we haven't created any yet, but we can start out by defining it here. So we'll call it jobs, and we'll just call it index. So when users hit our jobs route, which we'll define shortly, you will basically get this index view. So let's have a look at how we might go about creating a view. Laravel uses the Blade templating system to create views, and we've actually already got a couple of views that have come with Laravel and with our authentication setup. So let's have a look at how they're put together and see how we might be able to make this jobs index page for ourselves. So everything is going to be stored in this resources folder. If we go in there, you'll see a folder or a directory called views, and you'll see we've got two views here. We've got home.blade.php and we've got welcome.blade.php. Welcome.blade.php is basically this Laravel screen that you get when you do a fresh installation of Laravel. And the home.blade.php is what you'll get when you actually sign in as one of our users. So let's log in as our client. I'll make a new one because I don't remember what we made that. So name is going to be client. We'll make the email address client@client.com. Our role is client. We'll set a password. Might save it this time. So this screen you're seeing here is our dashboard essentially, and it's actually driven by this home.blade.php file. We had a brief look at Blade when we made our little contextual menu here that basically runs off our user roles. But let's have a closer look at this home.blade.php now and see what we've got. So when we open it up, you'll see that it extends layouts.app. So in our views folder, we've got this layouts directory, and you'll see we've got app.blade.php. So Blade obviously knows that a Blade file is a Blade file. So it doesn't use the app.blade.php. We just need to call it app, and we can use the dot syntax to navigate our file structure. So our views always start at this view folder, but then you can see we've extended layouts.app. And this layout is basically what's going to drive most of the look and feel of your site. This is where you'll set up the layout of menus and nav bars and bits and pieces, like if you wanted to have notifications and things like that, you'd build them into this template. And this allows you to essentially extend this template for each of your views and inherit all of that functionality, inherit all your menus, your login buttons, your register buttons, all those sort of things are going to be built into your layout, and then you're just going to extend it using another Blade file. So having a look here, you can see that they've actually defined, out of the box, they've defined a section called content, and it runs all the way down to the bottom of the file here where they've got end section. So everything that you see between the section content and the end section is basically going to be inserted into our layout. And we've got a call here, see yield content. So it's basically going to install our new, insert our new Blade file directly into our layout in that location. And if you were creating your own custom application, you would tidy this layout up a bit. You'd break it up into a head, a menu, a header, a footer, so that you've organised your code a bit more, so that you've just got it in bite-sized chunks and you can edit it and maintain it very easily. Our application is going to be quite simple though, so we're just going to leave it for the moment. In the last session, where we look at tidying things up and publishing to a server or a web service, we might have a look at just tidying up the styling a bit, and we might clean up our Blade templates a little bit as well. For the moment though, we want to basically just create that index page for our jobs controller. So in our views folder, I'm actually going to organize my views into their own folders, and I'll do that just by creating a new folder and calling it jobs. Within this folder, we want to create ourselves a new file called index.blade.php, and that's going to give us an empty Blade file here, and we want to do the exact same thing that our home controller is currently doing. So where do we begin with our Blade file? If we have a look at our home.blade.php file here, we basically need to define what layout we're going to use. So we're also going to extend layouts.app. So the syntax for Blade just starts with the @ symbol. We'll say extends layouts.app. And it's as simple as that. So we've already inherited all that extra functionality. All we need to do now is fill out the sections that our app layout requires. And at this point in time, it's simply the @yield content field. So let's add our content section now. Again, it's just @section, and you can name it. So these are flexible, you can name them whatever you like. So if you had a layout that was going to control a full website or a full application for you, you might want to define more sections. And I normally break that down into things like page title, page description, things that I might want to use all over the shop. So for example, using a page title, you can then go into your app.blade.php and you can actually insert the title in the title of your site here. So currently it's set to the configuration or the app name, which you can see is Freelance Hub because we set that in our environment file. But you can also set the title to your page title, for example. So you can name it dashboard or whatever on each individual page without actually having to manually change it, simply by setting a section here called page title and including that in the appropriate places. So we'll have a look at that at the end of the series as well when we're just tidying things up a bit. At the moment though, we want to just build out this page very quickly, and let's see what happens if we just make a heading and just call it jobs. So I've just saved that file, and if we now go to our application and go to freelance test.test/jobs, we get a 404 error. We've created our controller and we've created our view, but we've not told our application where to find that view. So we need to have a look at our web routes and define our route. So again, we had a brief look at this in a previous lesson, but if you view our routes folder and the web.php, you'll see that we've got some routes defined here that basically tell our application where to find our controllers. So when we hit that jobs URL, what do we actually want our application to do? And we just need to define a route using the route command there. It's going to respond to a GET request. So just viewing a page is always going to be a GET request. And we'll just call it GET jobs. And we just need to tell it that our jobs controller is going to handle this request, and it's going to use the index method within that jobs controller. And that's all we have to do. So if I save that now and go back to our site or our application and just refresh, you'll see we get our jobs page with our content already in there. Now we don't need to do too much on this view just yet. We will visit it again when we've got some jobs ready to display. But I guess the next step for us is to have a look at how we can actually collect the data required to create jobs and edit and update and those sort of things. So let's have a look at that now. Okay, let's have a look at how we can now set up our system to allow our users to create a job. So this is going to involve another view and another route. Let's have a look at our, where's our jobs controller gone? Here it is. So just like the index view, our create view is simply going to return a view, our create method is going to return a view that displays our new job form. So we'll just call a view and ask it to load the jobs.create view. Save that, and just to save time, I'm just going to duplicate our index file here, and I'll just rename that to create.blade.php. Okay, so now we can create a job. Now Laravel allows you to use plain HTML, which we're doing there just by adding a heading. But as far as forms go, they can be quite tedious to build and maintain. So we can actually use a library or a package that is going to simplify it for us. And this package actually used to be a part of Laravel itself, but it's later been removed, and it's now maintained by the Laravel Collective, which is basically an open source group that just maintains these tools that a lot of developers found really useful and time saving, but that don't quite fit within the Laravel ecosystem or the base framework anymore. So Laravel Collective, and down the bottom here we've just got HTML and forms. If we open that up, you'll notice that it's quite easy to install using Composer. So we just need to Composer require Laravel Collective HTML. So if we head back to our terminal, and ask it to require the Laravel Collective HTML package, it should begin loading that now. And that's probably going to take a couple of minutes, so I'll just pause the video here and I'll be back with you when this completes. Okay, so Composer has now downloaded and installed the HTML forms package from Laravel Collective for us. There are another couple of steps that we need to follow in order to complete the installation though, and they are listed on the Laravel Collective website. So you'll see here we've done the Composer require Laravel Collective, but next we need to add this line to our providers array. So there's some configuration files within Laravel that basically allow us to configure pretty much the entire application and framework, and this is one of the things we're going to configure. So if we just copy this line here, it's going to import some of the required functionality into our application. So it tells you what to do. Add your new provider to the providers array of config/app.php. So if we go back to our project here, you'll see a config file, and within that we've got app.php. And there's a few things in here. You can explore this if you like and find out what they do, but it basically just allows you to set up and customize the application as required. And you'll see we've got a field here called providers, and it opens a big array, and it's got a lot of system providers there and a few service providers. But we've got this package service providers area. You can really put this line of code anywhere. However, it's good to just follow the standard and organize it. So we've installed a package. So let's install the packages provider. It also asks us to add a couple of aliases. So we'll create the form and the HTML aliases here. And it just goes in the same file, so config app.php, but it goes in the aliases array. So if we go back to the project, you'll see here class aliases. So I'm just going to add these to the end. Okay, just fix up that indentation and save that file. So we've now actually fully installed that HTML forms package from Laravel Collective now. So let's have a look at how we can actually go about creating a form. So if you have a look in the Laravel Collective documentation, it basically lists all of the steps you need to follow, how to add labels and how to do all of that. You can review that if you like, but I'm going to show you how to do it for our simple application now. So we want to open a form, and we can just use the blade shortcuts or the blade syntax to insert items into our page. So it's using the two squiggly braces there. What you need to open a form. So form open, and in here you need to provide an array of parameters or an array of attributes. So when you normally open an HTML form, you'll define an action method, and our action is going to be to call our jobs controller. and we're going to use the store method on our jobs controller. So closing the form is exactly the opposite, just form close. And now we're ready to actually build out our form inside here. Now, I like to break this down into divs using Bootstrap. So let's make a div class and call it a form group. Okay, close the div. And the beauty of Blade is that you can really mix and match your Blade syntax with your HTML, and it just works pretty seamlessly for you. So within this div, we're going to ask our form to create a label, and we need to define the field that the label is for. So it's going to be for our title field, and the label is going to be job title. And that's all there is to it. To create our actual form field, okay, we want form text. The name of the field is going to be title. You can pre-fill a value. So on the edit form, you'll see in here we will actually insert some syntax here to put in the current name or the current title. But for the moment, it's just going to be empty. And we can also pass an array of attributes. So we could set a class here for styling, and we'll do that. We'll set a Bootstrap class of form control, which will give us some styling out of the box. And we can also specify a placeholder. So I'll call that job title. Okay, so we could try and view that now, but we haven't actually defined a route for our create page yet, or our create form. Now we could define each of our routes individually, but this file is going to get quite long as a result of that. And Laravel actually makes it simple for us to do. So when we created our controller, we defined it as a resource controller. We also have the option to define our routes as a resource. Okay, so we can say route resource / jobs, and it's going to be just our jobs controller. Okay, so if we save that now, we should actually be able to go to jobs, create. Okay, and here we have our create a job form. So you'll notice that it's already styled it for us, and it's given us our job title field. And you'll notice that our route has happened without us having to do anything. We've got one line in the routes file. We can go to /jobs. We can go to /jobs create. And eventually we'll be able to go to basically look up our jobs and edit and delete and things by changing that URL. But let's finish this form to start with. So when we created our jobs table, we had 3 fields: title, description, and budget. So let's have a look at how we can add a text area to our form. We're going to follow the same method basically, so we can copy this if you like, or you can type it out each time, it's up to you. So here we're going to change the field name to description, and it's going to become our job description. Now this text, we will change it to a text area. Again, we'll name it description. Doesn't have a value at the moment, but the placeholder is also going to be job description. We can just do the same again and add our budget in. Change the label there. And we actually have a number field available to us, similar to plain HTML. We'll name it budget. Doesn't have a value at the moment. Placeholder, we can call that budget as well. And you can even specify you want the budget in dollars or whatever you happen to require. And we can also specify here a step of any. So when you define a number field, it's actually asking for an integer, okay? But by defining the step any, it allows you to basically enter any sort of numerical value into that field. So let's have a look at that now. Okay, you'll see I can add something like 12.5. Okay, and it doesn't complain. If we remove the step any and save that, okay, it's going to complain at us because we have to have an integer. But considering we're using dollars and maybe cents, let's just add in that step any. Okay, next we need a submit button. We need to be able to send this form off. That's super simple. Form submit. Post job. Okay, and there we go. You can style this button if you like using Bootstrap. We'll just leave it for the moment. There we go, we've created a form quite simply. It wasn't too much effort. And now we need to look at how we can accept the submission from this form and actually insert it into our database. So to do that, we'll go back to our jobs controller because that is the big boss, and we've got this store request. So what we want to do in here basically is validate the data we got. Is the data right? Is it in the right format? Are they the right types? Do we have the fields we need? And Laravel allows for fairly simple validation. So if we call our controller's validate method, now you can't see the validate method because it inherits it from this controller class, but it is there. So if we validate our request, so when this store method is called, it's passed a request and it's put into a variable called request as well. So we want to validate our request with an array of validation options. So we just need to specify the name of our field, which is the name, its title. Specify that it's required, and this field should be a string. So you can just use the poll and call it a string. Same with description. We'll make fairly simple validation here. We'll just say it's required. And again, we need a string. With our budget field, okay, we'll make that required as well because we really need that in our application. But this time, instead of string, we're going to say it's numeric. Okay. Now, if I was to just save that and hit post job, okay, it just bounces straight back because it's failed validation. But we haven't really provided any feedback to our user about what's actually going on here. So let's have a look at how we can add those messages to our form and provide a bit of feedback so that our validation is actually meaningful to our user. To add this feedback method or this messaging to our system, we're actually going to use the power of Blade to include it in all our pages to save ourselves a bit of time. So let's go and create a file and call it messages. So in our resources directory, views, you can add a folder here and call it components. And what I mean by components is like page components. So eventually you build your menu out in here and your header and whatever you need to in here. But for the moment, let's create a file called messages.blade.php. And we're going to use this to generate any messages that are thrown at us by our validation or even messages we can send to our users for things like jobs being saved or updated or whatever the case might be. So within this blade file that we've just created called messages, the first thing we're going to do is see if there are any errors returned by Laravel itself for validation and things. So first thing we're going to do is see if we've got any. So if the count of a variable called errors, which is provided by Laravel, is greater than 0, okay, we want to basically list them out to the user. So we need to close off our if statement there. Basically, if there are errors, let's loop through them. So for each of our errors, okay, using that syntax there, so we're looking at our errors object and finding all of them, and we want to refer to them simply as error. Okay, don't forget to end the for each loop as well. So for each of our errors, we're going to open a div, and we're going to use the standard bootstrap classes of alert and alert danger. So we've had an error, we've had something go wrong, let's alert our user with a danger alert. And all we need to do here is use blade syntax to include the error. And that's it for system errors. But while we're here, let's add some ways that we can provide our own feedback to our users. And we're going to do it by setting sessions when we actually set these messages. So if session success, so if we've set a success message, okay, and if, and we're generally only going to set one of these at a time, so we don't need to loop. But if we've got a success, we want to also set an alert. This time, let's make it an alert success. Close the div. And again, it's as simple as using blade to display our session success. Likewise, we can set our own error messages. Okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be an error, but it might be when you want a user to go back and check their input or make sure they set a confirm field or whatever if they're deleting an item. So we'll set a session of error and just display that session error. Okay, so we've set up how to display them. Now we need to insert that into our layouts, into our app layout, so that all of our views automatically inherit this messaging capability. So we want to do that within our page content. So you'll see here we've got @yield content, and we probably want to include that. So include was in our components folder, .messages. So include components.messages. Now if we go back and try and submit our form again, okay, so we've made an error in our messages folder. Let's have a look. Okay, see here, we've opened an if statement, but I've only said end, not end if, so that should fix that. So if we try and post this job now, it automatically comes up with the errors. Title field is required, description is required, and budget is required. Okay, and that's by creating our validation on the jobs controller here. When we do have valid input though, we do need to do something with it. So what are we going to do? And the first thing we need to do is basically create a job object. Now by default, our controller doesn't know how to create a job. So we need to import our jobs model. So you just basically need to, at the top of your file, use app/job, which is the model that we created, which can be found in the app folder, and we've got a job there. Okay, so to create our job, we just ask for a new job. If only it was that simple in real life. Okay, so once we've got our job, we need to set our parameters or attributes on that job. So the job title is going to come from the request we've been passed from our form. It comes from the input array and it's called title. And it is really just that simple. So we can do this for all of our fields. So the job description again comes from the request input and description field. Same again for our budget. Okay, and that's all there is to it. Now, to save this model, all we would need to do is basically hit job and save. But we probably want to log this against our client, so against our user field or user ID. So let's have a look at how we can do that. And we're going to use Eloquent's ORM relationships again. I'll just save this just for the moment. We're going to change this in a second. But we want to be able to assign this to a user ID. We want to know who posted the job. And to do that, we actually need to add another field. We need to add a user ID field. So let's have a look at how we can modify our database structure using an artisan migration. Okay, and we just have to be really descriptive when we make a migration and it will do half the work for us. So we want to add user ID to jobs table. If we'd enter on that and go and have a look at the migration itself. Okay, it already pre-fills with everything. So it's got our jobs table already set up here, ready to go. So all we have to do is add our logic. So to the table, we want to add an integer called user_ID. If we downgrade, if we do the migration in reverse, we need to ask the table to drop our column called user ID. And that's it. So if we migrate that now, it will add that to the database for us. Okay, and it's done it. Add user ID to jobs table. We then need to define a relationship between our job and our user. Okay, so we're expecting that our users are going to be able to post multiple jobs. We want them to come back and use the site over and over again. So they're going to have a one-to-many relationship. One user can have many jobs, but a job can really only be posted by one user. Okay, so our user here in our user model can have jobs, and we just need to define that this has many of the app job model, and it's referenced by user ID that we've just created. And that's it. So we do the opposite in our job model here. Okay, so we create a public function called user. And we can only have one user, as we've discussed. So let's say return and it belongs to the app user model. Okay. So if we go back to our jobs controller now, we've set up the relationships, so we can now basically save this with our users' details in mind. So the first thing we need to do is know who our user is. So we'll import auth. Okay, so we'll import the authorization or the authentication library, and in here we can find our user. So our user is auth user. So that'll give us our currently authenticated user, and that's all you have to do. And what we can do, instead of saving the job by itself, we can ask our user to have a look at its jobs and save us a new one. And that will save that job model, and it will automatically associate it with our currently logged in user. Now, once we've done that, this store function isn't actually going to display anything to the user. So what we want to do is redirect our user back to our index page for jobs. But we also want to give them a message, and this is where we can set our success message and say the job was created. Okay, just to give them some feedback and let them know what's happened. We just need to return that. So it's return redirect, okay, with, and that gives you the option to save a session message there. So let's see what happens when we do this. So let's create a job called create a freelance platform. Okay. Budget, let's set the budget as $1,000. If we hit post job now, okay, so we've got an error here. It's telling us it's something to do with our messages file and this line here. So let's have a look and see what's going on. So if we have a look in here, okay, these aren't supposed to be declared as variables. Okay, let's go create again. Okay, so now it's working. It says here that the job was created. Let's have a look in our database and see if we can find it. So we had a jobs table here. And there we go, our two jobs are in there. So our error was just with our messaging. That's all sorted. So we've got our two jobs in here. It redirects back to this landing page. So we probably want to display our clients' jobs on this page so they can find them again. So let's have a look at how we can do that quickly. So if we go to our jobs controller, we need to look up our jobs and pass them to our index view. So the view can't really do anything without the information provided to it. So we need to find our jobs. So if we go jobs, and Laravel makes it super simple to pull these jobs out of the database. So we just simply ask our job model to return all the jobs it finds. And what that'll do, give us an array of a collection of all of our job models, which is great. However, this is going to give us all of our users' jobs, which we don't really want on the client dashboard. We just want the ones that relate to our individual clients. So what we can do is say find our user. So just like we did before. Okay, we've got our user there now. And instead of asking our job model for all of our jobs, we can actually ask our user model. Because we've defined the relationship, we can ask our user model for all the jobs. And we can pass that to our view. by specifying with jobs and passing in that array. So if we go to our index file here, we basically just want to loop through and list out all the jobs we've got. So I'm just going to do it really simple. You could do this in a table, you could do it in divs, you could create bootstrap cards, you can do it whatever you want, but just to demonstrate this, we'll just spit them out on the page. So the first thing we want to do is see if we've actually got any jobs returned to us. So if count of jobs is greater than 0, we'll end that if. So if we've got jobs, we want to loop through them. So for each jobs, give it an H4, why not? So we'll go for each jobs as a single job. We can then use blade syntax here just to simply fill out our page here. Welcome to session 4 of how to create a freelancing website using Laravel. In the previous lesson, we added the functionality for our clients to log in and post jobs to the site, as well as allowing freelancers to view the jobs that have been posted and see what they're about. In this session, we're going to add the functionality for freelancers to add jobs as favorites and keep track of them. And we will also add some messaging functionality between our users and our clients so they can communicate about jobs. So to begin, let's have a look at how to add favorites to the system. And this is fairly straightforward. We're going to need here that stores our freelancers' favorites. So let's jump in. We need to start off by creating our model. So we're going to ask PHP Artisan to make us a model, and it will simply be called a favorite. We'll also ask for a migration, and that'll get us going. Now, for all of you interested, you might notice I spelt favourite a little bit different. That's how we spell it in Australia and I believe the UK. Americans don't put the U in, but that's how we spell it here, so that's what we'll roll with today. And I believe the UK. Americans don't put the U in, but that's how we spell it here, so that's what we'll roll with today. So if we hit enter on that command, you'll see it's created our migration table for us. That's found in our database directory under migrations. So if we go into that, you'll see we've got our migration file here ready to go. And all we're going to do in this one is create 2 remote keys or foreign keys, so 2 integers. This is going to be our user ID, so we can see who saved the favorite. And we'll also create a key to store our job ID. And that's all a favorite is. We just need to keep track of a user and any job that they've identified as one that they want to keep as a favorite. We can run that migration now, and that will set up our database for us. Okay, all done. The next thing we need to do is define the relationships for this model, and it's going to be fairly simple. Okay, so our favorite will have a relationship with a job and also with our user. So all we need to do is just define these relationships in our model, the same as we've done in the past with our other items. So this favorite is going to have just one user, so we can say it belongs to our app user. We're also going to be able to associate just one job with this favorite. So it's going to be exactly the same. So it belongs to app job. Okay, and that's all there is to it for the favorite model. We also need to add our relationships for our job and for our user. So each job can have multiple favorites. Now we probably won't use this relationship in particular, but it's good to get in the habit of defining it anyway. So a job can have many favorites. And our user model is going to be exactly the same. Okay, so our user can have many favorites, and we hope they do. Okay, so we've set up relationships on our favorites model, our job model, and our user model. So they all know how to talk to each other now. But now we need to create a controller to add and remove our favorites from the system. So we can do that using Artisan. We can ask Artisan to make us a controller. Now I'm not going to make a resource controller in this case because we're only going to add probably the add functionality to it so that our users can save a favorite, and that's probably going to be enough for us at this point. So it's going to be our favorite controller, and it's probably going to be our simplest as well. So we can find it in HTTP controllers, and there it is, our favorite controller. Now, we're going to just add one simple method at the moment, and we're going to call it add favorite. And this is going to be passed a request from a form button that we'll create. Okay, so when we receive a form, we need to validate the form. We'll validate that request to ensure we get the information we need. And in this case, we just need the job ID, because the user ID we can gather from our Auth controller. So we've already know who's logged in, so we can use that to complete this adding of favorites. So we're going to need the job ID, which is going to be required, and we're expecting that to be an integer. So before we can find our user and create a new favorite, we need to import the functionality. So we need to use /auth, and we also need to use app favorite. Okay, now we get to use those features. So first thing we'll do is find our user, which is as simple as asking the Auth controller for our currently authenticated user. Then we need to create a favorite, which is really easy. We just ask for a new favorite. Next, we just need to set our job ID, which is going to come from the request that we just received, come from the input, and we're going to name it job ID. All we need to do now is save this, and we've seen this in the past, but because we've defined our relationship, we can actually use our user model to save our favorite so that we don't actually have to go and find our user ID. This will automatically associate the two. So we just access user favorites, ask it to save our new favorite. And like we've done in the past, we just need to return a redirect. So we need to tell the system or tell Laravel where we want our users to land after we've created our favorite. And we'll just return them to the jobs page. And let's return them to the actual job they were looking at, which is going to come from our input again, and it's just the same job ID. And we can send a success message, so with success, favorite added. Okay, so this should give us the functionality now to save our favorites. But what we need to do is think about putting a button on our jobs so that we can essentially reach this method. So we can do that in our jobs view. So if we go into resources and views, go in our jobs, and we'll put it on the show page. So when they actually view the details of a job, we can add the functionality in. And let's put it just below the job details heading at the moment. So we just need to open a form. The action will be to go to our our favorites controller, favorite controller, and we'll use the add favorite method. Just finish setting up the form with the method of post, and we should be good to go. So we just need to make sure we remember to close the form. And let's add a hidden field called job ID, which we already have available to us because in our job view here, we've already passed the job details and we've already accessed them later in the view. So we just pass the hidden job ID and set the fit value, and we just need to add a submit button. Okay, we'll say add to favorites. And let's make it a nice looking button with a simple and quick bootstrap button. Okay, and there we go. So we've done our migration here. So now we should just need to go back into this job here. Okay, if you have a look here, even though we've defined where we want to go in our form, so we've told it we want to submit to our favorite controller, and we've even specified the method, we haven't actually defined a route to get to that method in our routes file. So we need to do that even though we don't actually want to make it public. But if we go to our web routes here, and let's add a route to our favorite. So just route, it's going to be a post request, and we'll make it to favorites add. And it's our favorite controller. And it's the add favorite method on that controller. So we can verify this by asking Artisan to give us a route list. And if we find it, favorites add. Yep. So it should now allow us to conduct this. So let's have another look. Okay, so we've got an add to favorites button. Okay, what have we done here? So 404 not found. Okay, so we've sent it to job / the job ID, and yeah, if we have a look here, it's actually jobs. So we've got a typo in our favorite controller here. Yep, jobs. Okay, say it works now. So it's posting back to jobs/1. And here we go. So it says favorite has been added to the system for us. So we can actually verify that. And Coda actually has a MySQL functionality built in. The server is going to be freelance.test. Username freelance. Okay, so here we've got our favorites table, and if we go to content, you'll see we've got, it's in there twice because we had that little bit of an error, but you can see that it's actually added job ID number 1 to user ID 2's favorites, which is perfect. So what we want to do now is create our widget to actually display that on the right hand side of our site here. So let's have a look at how we might go about doing that. The first thing we need to do is be able to provide our favorites to that sidebar. And we're going to do it similar to our menu controller. So we use an app service provider to find favorites if applicable and provide it to our layout. But first we need a way to look up our favorites. So if we go back to our favorites controller, and we can create a public function here that's get favorites widget. And this will allow us to look up the favorites and return them. So the first thing we need to know is who do we actually have logged in. So if we ask for the currently authenticated user, and because we've defined our relationships, it's now actually really easy to look up our favorites. The first thing we're going to do though is check to see if we've got a logged in user, because we're going to use an app service provider. This may actually run before authentication, so we just need to check that we've actually got a user logged in already. And we can do that by making sure that our user is not null. Okay, and then we can actually use the method that we wrote for our menu controller to see if this user is a freelancer, because only freelancers are going to have favorite jobs. So we can ask our user if they have the role of freelancer. And if they do, let's make an empty favorites array, just in case we don't get anything back. So in case they haven't saved any favorites yet. So favorites is now going to be our user favorites. And it's simple as that. We've looked them up. But if we don't have a freelancer, so if a client's logged in, or if you'd created an admin role or something, you want to return something so that we know not to display our favorites widget. And we're going to do that by setting favorites to false. And we actually need to do that twice. So we've done it here when we found we don't have a freelancer, but we also need to do it if we don't find a user. Okay, so if we haven't got a valid user, we can't provide favorites, so we'll return false. Let's return our favorites variable, which is going to be either an array of favorites or it's going to be the value of false. So the next thing we need to do is add this to our service provider, similar to the way we did our menu controller back in, I think it was session 2. So if we go into providers in our HTTP directory, you get app service provider. And you can see here, this is where we've created our user menu. So we can do the same thing in here. So view composer, we want it to respond to all of our views. We're going to make a new function pass in a view, just close that off. So our favorites is going to come from app, HTTP, controllers, and our favorite controller. And we're going to ask for the get favorites widget. And then we'll provide the view with call it favorites widget. Okay, and it should be as simple as that. So all of our views now should have this favorites widget available. And remember, it's either going to be an array of our favorites or it's going to be the value of false. So we need to now add this favorites widget to our layout, and we're going to create it as a component. So let's go into our components folder, make a file, and we'll call it favorites widget .blade.php. Okay, and if we open this up, the first thing we want to do is see if we were returned a valid set of favorites. And we can do that using Blade syntax and just ask if favorites widget doesn't equal false, okay, then we must have received something back. We'll end our if there. So if we've got favorites, the first thing we want to do is put a bit of a heading up to let people know that this is my favorites. And then we'll go through and check that we received some. So if the count of our favorites widget is greater than 0, always remember to end the if statements. So if we've got favorites available to us, we want to loop through them. So for each of our favorites widget as a favorite, don't forget to end the loops. They don't auto-complete for you like curly braces. So for each, we want to add a link, and the link will be to our jobs sort of module or our jobs controller. And then we need to insert the favorite ID. So we're actually returning the actual object. So we could have made our own little array with an ID and the name, but in this case it's going to be fairly simple. So if we go favorites or favorite, then we'll return the job ID. Okay, then I'll add a list item. And for the list item text, we just want our favorite job title. So that should insert the title of our job in there for us. Close off the list item, close off the A, and we should probably also just in here start an unordered list. And after the end of our for each, we'll close that unordered list. That's going to annoy me, so I'll just indent that. Now, if we don't have any items here, so we can go at else. We can just add a little paragraph here. You have not saved any favorites. Okay, so that's our widget. So this is now going to create a little bit of HTML that basically just lists out our favorites. So if we save that now, we now need to insert it into our layout. So if we go down to our layouts and our app.blade.php, so our app layout, scroll down to the bottom where we've created our little page structure here, you'll notice we've got this empty column here, and we created this earlier kind of on purpose so that we could include our favorites. And all we need to do is say include components dot favorites widget. Okay, and this should now load our favorites just in this space here. So let's have a look. Cool. So we got our favorites, and we did duplicate one because we had our little login issue. But that's all it is to it. So we've now got our favorites, and you can now click on that. Takes you straight to the job, and you're good to go. Okay, the next thing we want to do is add the ability for our freelancers and our clients to communicate about a job. So we've created our favorites. We've already got this job details page, and I think this is probably a good place to add a little bit of messaging functionality. So we'll add a send message function here, or view conversation button here that will take us to a page that will let us message backwards and forwards. Now, the best way to probably do this, because we're involving a job, is to create a thread. So we'll create a message thread based on this job, and we'll add the participants, or add our users, so our client and our freelancer. We'll add them to the thread, and then we'll add messages to the thread as well. So we're going to sort of need a couple of models here, as well as a relationship table. So we'll create a thread model, a message model, and then we also need to create a table that's going to track basically our thread participants. And using Laravel, we can set up a many-to-many relationship. So many users can have many threads, and threads can have many users. And there's a way to do that in Laravel or in Eloquent that's pretty handy, but it requires an intermediate table. So we'll have a look at doing that. So the first thing, or the starting point, I guess, we'll just clean this up a bit. We did with everything else, we'll just ask Artisan to make us a model called thread. And we'll ask for a migration file as well. Okay, so we should have a create threads file here in our database migrations. And all we're going to do in here is track the job ID. And it's really all we need, because as we mentioned, we're going to create a many-to-many relationship between our threads and users. So in here we just need to be able to specify our job ID, so specify the job that this thread relates to. And that's it. We then need to create a table to associate. We then need to create a table to associate our users with this thread. So we're going to ask Artisan to make us a migration, but it's not actually going to relate to a particular model. So we're going to ask it to make a migration, and we'll call it create thread user table. And the order is actually quite important here. So Laravel by default will take the two tables, so the thread table and the user table, in alphabetical order for the relationship. And there's plenty of documentation on this on the Laravel site, but I'm going to show you how to do it practically. But that is one thing you need to do, is get the thread and the user tables in the right order there. Okay, and in here all we need to do is add our two foreign keys. So they're going to be both integers. First one will be our thread ID, and the second will be our user ID. So it now doesn't matter whether the user is a client or a freelancer. We're just associating people with with our thread. One thing I will do though is just go back to the create threads table. And we're actually going to make this, we're going to set these as soft deletes. And that's just done by table soft deletes, and then in the model we'll add the soft deletes functionality when we get to it. So we've created somewhere to store our threads, we've created somewhere to store the users that are participating in those threads, but we also need to create the actual message model. So if we ask PHP Artisan to make us a model called message, and create the migration as well. Okay, so create messages table. So in here, what we need to store is our message. That's the most important bit. So let's go add a medium text and call it message. And I'm just talking about really simple messaging here. You can change these models to include files and all sorts of things. But for this example, we're just going to create basically a text-based message to display to our users. The other things we need to store here are the thread ID. So we're going to create an integer for our thread ID. Okay, so we can associate the message with the thread. And I'm also going to store in here the user ID. In this way, it doesn't matter who posts to the thread, okay, which of our participants. By storing the user ID here, we'll be able to identify which one of those users it was, so that we can sort of create some dialogue there, tell each user who it was that posted, so they don't get confused. And that's all we're going to need from that. We're also going to set this one to soft deletes. So when you've got a lot of relationships going on, it's pretty important to keep this information in the database, just in case somebody does become deactivated or whatever. At some point, we still want to be able to display the messages about a job to the client or to the freelancer, even though the user might not be available in the system anymore. So the way to do that is by using soft deletes. So we've created our tables here, and we can ask Artisan to migrate those for us. Okay, we've created the threads table, created the thread user table, and we've created the messages table. So now we need to define all these relationships that we've just talked about. And what we're going to do is let's have a look at our thread model here. Now the thread is going to have 3 relationships for us. It needs to know who our users are, so our participants. It needs to track the messages that have been posted to the thread, and it also needs to know which job it belongs to. But before I forget, let's import our soft deletes functionality. So use Illuminate database, Eloquent, soft deletes. And then within the class itself, use soft. Okay, so that in conjunction with the soft deletes that we put in the table, will track that for us automatically. So we need to define our relationships. So we said we needed a relationship with our users. And a thread is going to have multiple users. Obviously we want a conversation between at least 2 people. So let's return that this belongs to many app user. Now we haven't actually seen this belongs to many command yet, and that's basically going to allow us to do our many-to-many relationship. So many users have many threads, and threads have many users. And this is, Laravel knows how to handle this. So if we say belongs to many, it's going to look up that table that we created, the thread users table. And as long as we've specified it in the right order, so thread and then user in alphabetical order, it will find the IDs within that table and it will manage this relationship for us, and it's pretty cool, and we'll see it a little bit later on. So we've set up our user relationship. We also want to track the messages for this thread. So public function messages, and we just need to return that this has many app message. And being a one-to-many sort of relationship, we need to specify that we're going to use the thread ID in the messages table to track that relationship. The other relationship we spoke about was the job relationship. So which job does this thread apply to? And it's only going to be one. Okay, so this thread is going to belong to our job. So app/job. Okay, and that should handle those relationships for us for our threads. We also need to specify the relationship for the message. Okay, so where does the message, or who does the message belong to? What thread does it belong to? So we can define that. Actually, first let's import our soft delete functionality as well, because I'm really good at forgetting to do that. So illuminate database, eloquent, soft deletes, and use soft deletes. Okay, now we can define our relationships. So public function, this is going to belong to just one thread. Okay, a message can really only live within one thread. So let's return the relationship. This belongs to app thread. The other thing that a message has is a user. Okay, and a message can only have one user. So again, we will return this belongs to app user. Okay, that's as simple as that. Now we also need to add the relationships on our user table. So or our user model. Okay, so we've already decided that a user can have many threads, and we set up our relationship as a many-to-many. So again, this is going to belong to many app thread. The other thing we have is messages. So a user can have many messages, but a message can only have one user. So this is going to be has many relationship with our app message. And the field that we've defined is user ID to track that. Okay, so we've now set up a thread model, a message model, and all the relationships we need. So we now need to start building in the actual functionality, how a message is going to be saved, viewed, all that sort of thing. So we're going to create a controller. Now you could split this into a thread controller and a messages controller, but I think that's a little bit unnecessary in this particular instance. So let's simplify it and just make a thread controller that will control both threads and messages for us. And this is a fairly simple example of implementing threads and messaging. So if you do have more complex examples, so you may be able to send direct messages to a client without a job involved, or communicate with admins or something like that, you may want to split this into threads and messages. But for our simple purpose, or our simple example, let's just make a thread controller and do it all from the same place. So the controller has been created successfully, and there it is. Took a second to pop up, but our thread controller is now available. So what are we going to need? In this, we're going to need to import some functionality, so import our models. And we're going to need our thread. So to manage threads, we need to be able to use them. We also need to talk about our messages. And if we also import our auth, we'll be able to find out which user we've currently got using the app and access the user model as well. So I guess the first item on the list would be to create a thread itself. So let's make a create thread method here, and we'll pass it a request. So we'll submit a form by using a button, so the user won't have to really input anything. We'll just set up a button for them. And as always, we need to validate our request to make sure that we received the information that we require. So let's have a think about what we actually need from this request. So we already know who is requesting this thread because we've got access to the user model. And in this case, it's actually only going to be our freelancers. So if we have a look at this page here, if it was our client viewing the job, they're not going to request the thread because they don't know who they're going to be talking to. They're not going to have anyone assigned to talk to. So it's only going to be our freelancers that are going to be able to create a thread in this case. So we'll just add a button here to start a new thread, and that way we know to assign the freelancer, which is the currently logged in user, and we'll assign the client, which we can work out from the job details because we've stored the user or the client against that job. So that's all we really need basically, is to know the job ID. And we can derive our users from the information we already have about the job. So the job ID is going to be required, and we do need it to be an integer. If it's not an integer, we've done something wrong. So once we've worked that out, we can create a new thread. And we want to set the job ID on that thread. So set the job ID that we've just received. And then we can actually save the thread. So remember when we created our thread table, all it stored was a job ID. And we're going to we've got that in-between table. It's going to manage our relationship between our thread and our users. So we now need to assign our users to this thread. And we already discussed that our freelancer is the only one going to be able to create the thread. So our freelancer will be the currently logged in user. Auth user not save. Okay. So that has to be our freelancer. If he's going to see this button, and we're going to restrict this button later, but if he's going to see this button and create a thread, he has to be our freelancer. To find our client, it's actually going to be the thread job user. Let me just make sure I got that right. Yep. So we can look at the thread and we can identify the job from that thread because we've just set the job ID and saved it. And then in our job relationship, we've actually got the user model there. So we can identify which user it was based on the job that we've assigned. Now to associate the users with our thread, we just use our thread model or our current thread, access the users, and hit save. So save our freelancer, and we'll do exactly the same thing. Okay, now you could add more. If you had a more complex model, all you need to know is their user ID and load up their user. So if we knew their ID was 6, for example, but you generally pass it in a variable, you'd say user equals user find, let's just use a blank ID. So you do something like that to find the user, and then you do the same thing and just replace this with the actual user variable there. But we don't need that in this case. We're just talking between freelancers and clients. So we've actually already associated them. So it wasn't all that hard. So once we've done that, we want to redirect our user back to, or we can redirect them to our new threads page and load in the current thread. And that's it. The next thing we need to be able to do is create a message. So how do we save a message on this thread? So we will create a public function here as well that creates a message. We'll pass in a request. And we'll also pass in the ID, and this will be the thread ID. As always, we want to validate our input. And in this case, we're only going to pass the actual message across because, again, we're going to know which user is posting the message based on the currently logged in user. So a message is going to be required, and it's got to be a string. Once we've validated that, let's create a new message. Let's set the message to our request input message. Okay, now we also need to set the thread ID on this. So message thread ID is just going to be the ID that we passed in with the post request. We also need to know who is posting. So we'll ask our auth user for the details. And we'll use the user model to save this message, to save us a little bit of legwork. So user messages, save our message. Pretty simple functionality really when you break it down into little steps. So we'll return a redirect. Because we've just created a message on a thread, we probably want to go back to that thread. Okay, and that's the thread ID that we passed in up here, and we used it here as well, so we can just access it there. And if you want, you can provide a success message or message saved. Okay, pretty simple. So we're not going to add delete functionality as with email. Once you've sent it, and we'll leave it at that. You could quite simply add your delete functionality in here, but we're not going to bother. Let's just create our messages. The other thing we want to be able to do is show our thread. So we're going to need a show function. Okay, so we'll assign this to a root in a second, and essentially this is going to be where we load our thread and send it to our view. So let's make a function here, show thread, and we really need to see the thread ID. So what we need to do is find our thread, and it's really simple in Laravel. Just ask the model to find by ID. And then we're going to return a view, which we'll create shortly. And it'll be threads.show. And we'll pass it our thread. And the beauty of Laravel's Eloquent is that the relationships we have defined will allow us to find everything we need about a thread, including messages, users, everything we need, just by doing this one line, thread find by ID, and passing it to our view. Then we can access the users, the job, the messages, everything will be available just by the relationships we've defined, which is pretty cool in this instance because it's going to give us a lot of information and very, very quickly. Okay, so now that we've set this up, let's have a look at how we can add the button to our job details here that will allow us to either create a new thread or view any existing thread that might be there. But really, to create this button, I want to be able to know whether we've got a freelancer logged in or a client, because if it's a freelancer, we want to be able to allow them to create a thread or view one that they've already got. And if it's a client, we want them to be able to select from any available threads that might be around. So we really need to pass to this view details about our user and about any threads that might be about. So to do that, we're going to have to change our jobs controller a little bit and provide more information to our show method here. So we want to add these details to our view. So let's have a quick look now at how we can add that information. And the first thing we're going to do is get our current user. So do we have our user or our auth already added? And we do. So in our show method here, we can find our current user, so we can find information about them. So auth user is going to give us that. The next thing we want to do is find out what kind of user they are, and we can use a PHP switch to do everything a little bit quicker. So if we go user, role, name, okay, that'll tell us whether it's freelancer, whatever. So in the case that it is a freelancer, we can set some functionality. Okay, break. We'll do a case of client. Break. And then just in case something happens, so we add admins or whatever, they're not going to be a freelancer or a client. So we want to add some default functionality here as well. Okay. So first things first, what if we do have a freelancer? What are we going to do for our freelancer? So we need to have a look and see if they have any threads. So let's create an empty array just to catch anything out of the ordinary. Okay, and our threads are going to come from our user threads. So we're going to lean on that relationship we created with our threads, and we're going to ask it to look for threads where the job ID is the current job ID. Okay, and we've already looked up our job here, so we've got access to that information. We're also going to ask for just the first thread. So we really only want our users to create one thread per job, or our freelancers to create one thread per job, so that we can keep the transaction or the message transaction all in one place. So this is going to return us a thread. The next thing we need to do is find out if our thread actually contains anything. So if our thread is null, okay, so if nothing was returned, this is where we want to be able to add a button in. And the way we're going to do it is by passing the value of false. So we've got no threads. If it's not null, so else, our threads array is going to have a new item called thread. And we're also going to make a variable here and call it user type. And call it Freelancer. In the case of our client, we want to basically return all the threads for this job. So we'll specify that our user type is a client. And our threads are going to be the job threads. And what I might do is just make an empty array there as well, just in case. Okay, and that's it. So we're going to pass all the threads for this particular job, and we know that the job has threads associated with it, or we've set up that relationship. So it's going to find any threads related to this job, which are all going to belong to the client. In the case that we have an admin login, or let's say a role, so let's set a user type as false so that we can identify that. And let's pass an empty array through to our system so that we don't have any errors. What we need to do now is pass all of this information to our view. And the best way to do that is by using an array. Okay, so here's our data array. And in here we need to specify the job, okay, because we're passing more than one value. We need to put it all in one array. So we'll pass the job in. Let's also pass the user type in so that we can do some work with that. And we also need our threads array. So instead of with job, we just want to pass in all the data we've collected so far. And this will allow us to then work out the best way to display a button on our job show view here. So jobs and show. So below our job here, we're going to add some functionality to display the appropriate information to our user. Okay, so below our job details here, we want to create our messages section. So I'm just going to put a horizontal line there just so that we can separate our content a little bit. Let's add a heading and call it messages. Okay, and now we want to start doing a bit of our logic to process the data that we passed our view. So the first thing we want to know is what user type we have. So let's have a look and find out if our user type is a freelancer. Okay, and PHP comparisons are always 2 equal signs. I can end that if here now. Next thing we want to do is find out if we got threads. So we set the threads to false if there weren't any in the system yet. So we can do another if statement here and ask if our threads are false. So if they're not false, we've got some messages to display. Okay, we're going to have an else in here so that we can handle the case where there's no threads. So if we've got threads available, we want to loop through them. And look, really for our freelancer, we should only have one, but let's do this to be safe. So for each of our threads, as a thread and end our for each. All I'm going to do is put a link on the page. So ahref equals, we're going to make a root /threads shortly. So /threads, and then we want to know the thread ID. Okay, we'll actually make this link a button, because we're only going to have one, so let's make it a button and we'll make it a primary button. We're just going to say view conversation. Okay, obviously if you did have more than one, you'd want to personalize this a bit, as we'll do when we get down to our clients. Okay, so we've added the button. That's going to be about it. If we don't have any threads available, we want to add a button that's going to allow us to create one. And we'll use a form to do that. So let's open a form up real quick. We'll set the action to our thread controller, and we added a method within that controller called createThread. And don't let me forget to set up the roots for all of these, or we're going to have errors. We'll set the method to post. Close our form before I forget about it. And all we're going to need is a hidden field on our form that tracks our job ID. Because remember, we worked out we could get our freelancer's ID and our client ID from information we already had about our authentication and about our job itself. So we just need to now add a button, a submit button, and say, what are we going to say here? Create a conversation, send a message. Let's say send message. And let's make this a nice button as well. So let's set a class button primary. Okay, and that's it. So once we set up the roots to handle that form, it'll post it to our thread controller's createThread, and it will set that up for us. And we already know that that's going to redirect us to our threads page and load up the current thread. So that's really going to be it for our clients, to our threads page and load up the current thread. So that's really going to be it for our clients. Our freelancers. If our user type is client, what are we going to do? So the first thing we need to do is count our threads. So if threads, if the count of our threads, is greater than 0, then we can actually display them. Okay, we want an else in there as well, just in case. So if we have threads available, we need to find a way to describe our threads, and I guess the best way is going to be by the freelancer or by the freelancer's name. So if we have threads available, we want to loop through those threads so that we can display them. So for each of our threads as a thread, I always forget to end my for each loops, so let's do that now. Let's make it end for each. So for each of our threads as a thread, we want to display something to the user. So let's tell them who the participants are. Okay, and we'll make a bit of a list of participants to show them. And we'll go, if the count of our thread users is greater than 0, and we know that it's going to be, but you never know in the world of programming what is going to happen. So if we have a good count of users, for each of those users, for each of the thread users as thread user, in the for each, we basically want to add a list item that has the thread user's name in it. And it's really easy. These Laravel relationships, or the Eloquent relationships, just make your life way too easy. And it's as easy as asking for the thread user's name. And the list item, and the for each, and end the if, and then end the unordered list there. And we also want to provide a link to view that thread now. Well, we're going to make it a button. So just ahref, it's going to be /threads/ our newly found thread ID. Let's make it a button, so class equals button primary. And these are, again, just bootstrap stylings, and just say view conversation. Okay, and the A, and let's just put a horizontal line just to separate these messages, because there might be a few. If we don't find any threads, so if there's no threads yet, we need to display a message to our client and just say no messages found, because we haven't got any just yet. And realistically, that should be it for the messages view, for the jobs view. We also need to create this threads view that we've been talking so much about. So in our views folder, I'm just going to make another folder and call it threads. And within that, we just need a file to have our, didn't let me name it, that wasn't very useful. So here we just want to make a show.blade.php. So it'll be our threads.show view. This is going to extend our app layout. So that's layouts.app. Then we just need to start a section here called content. And end the section. This is where we put our page content. So in here, let's have a look back to our thread controller to see what information we passed to our show thread. So in here, we just basically passed an array or a collection of threads, and that was it. So let's have a look at how we can... Yes, we've provided a thread. So we can start the page with a heading that's got the job title, because each thread is going to be about a particular job, so it's a good way to describe the thread to our users. So using Laravel's Eloquent, again, it's way too easy. We just ask the thread for its job and ask the job for its title. And then if we really want to be fancy, we can just append messages to it, so we know that we're viewing messages about that job. Now, it would be really good if we had some basic details about the job available as well. So let's just add a paragraph that has our job description in it. We'll then put a nice horizontal line in just to separate the job description from our messages. And next, we want to know what messages do we actually have in this conversation so far. We want to display them to our user. So if the count of our messages, so our thread messages, and again this is using Laravel's eloquent relationships, and it's super simple. So if the count of our messages is greater than 0, what do we want to do? So we probably want to loop through these messages and display them to the user. Now, we could do that, but we need to organise them some way. And I think the best way for something like this is by setting up a bit of a table quickly. It doesn't necessarily need headings and things, but it will let us sort of separate the names from the messages and keep everything in line pretty easy. So we'll create a table, and then let's loop through our messages. So for each of our thread messages as a single message, I always close them straight away, otherwise I forget and you end up in a world of trouble. So for each of our messages, we're going to create a table row. Let's create a table head. And sorry, I'm cheating a little bit here. I noticed that the padding wasn't quite right. So let's add some padding to this to just separate things a little bit. And in here we want to basically ask the message who its user was, so who posted this message and what was their name. Okay, we'll put that in the table head, create a table cell right next to it, and in here we want to put the message body essentially, so the message. Okay, and that should be it. That's going to list all our messages next to the name of the user that posted the message. One thing we do need to consider though is what if there aren't any messages? So we've gone if the count of messages is good, let's do this. Else we probably need to say, hey, we don't have any messages found. Okay. Now the other thing we need to do is allow our users to post a message or add a new message. So let's just separate our current messages out for a second, and let's create a form to create a message. And we've already set up the controller method for this. We just need to implement the form. So the action is going to be our thread controller, create message method. And in this we said we're going to pass through a request as well as the current thread ID. Okay, and I'll show you that now. So if we go back to our thread controller, create message, we're going to pass through the request as well as an ID. And the way to do that is to, instead of just having action thread controller create message, you create an array with the controller and method and the ID as well. And we can still add our attributes in here. Add our method in here. Okay, and we should be good to go. I'll close the form so I don't forget. And all we needed from our form was a message, because we're posting through the thread ID and the thread already knows about our participants, and our authentication already knows who is posting the current message. So the only thing we need is our actual message. So let's just organize this a little bit. Okay, create a div class, and this is all just bootstrap styling just to keep things a little bit organized. Okay, so the first thing we're going to want is a label, not a label, we want a label. The label is going to be for our message field. Okay, and let's say create a message. And we want to add a text area, so give people a little bit of space to write their message. It's going to be message. We're going to add no default content, but we are going to add some attributes. So we'll add the class of form control, just to provide some bootstrap styling. And we can also add a placeholder. You don't have to, but I like to have placeholders around. And we're going to say message and close the form. So this should now provide the form to our thread controller, and we should be good to go. So I think functionality wise, we've actually created everything we need. We just need to go through and create our web routes. So we've added a couple of forms and we need to define where they should go. So if we go into our routes, our web routes, we can add in what we need. And the first one is going to be creating a thread. Okay, so it's going to be a post request, and we already defined in our application that it will be threads /create, and it will be the thread controller create thread method. We also need to be able to show our thread. So we need to get request to threads, and it'll be threads with an ID. Okay, and we'll handle that with our thread controller show thread method. We also need to define routes for our messages. So we're going to need to post our messages initially, and let's set that up to threads ID new message. And again, it's our thread controller going to handle this. As I mentioned right back at the start of this, you can set up your threads and your messages separately, but I really think this is a simple implementation and it's not required. But if you were going to expand this, probably a good idea to separate them. So I've just set that up to thread controller and create message. So if we look at our thread controller, we've got create thread, create message, and show thread. Okay, and we should be good to go. So let's have a look. So we're already here as a freelancer. Let's refresh the page. And I've got a typo in our, where is it? So we've got a typo here, belong to many. It should be belongs to many. And I'm guessing that's going to be in our thread, belongs to, belong to. There you go. Try that again. No, I've done it more than once by the sound of that. This belongs to many, belong to many. We got thread, user, belong to many. There we go again. Okay, so refreshing the page, here we go. So we're logged in as a freelancer, we've got the messages section, we've got a button here, send message. If we click on that, we've got a job ID field is required. So we've made a mess up somewhere. Here we go. So we've hidden our job ID, but we didn't actually set the job ID. So we'll need to load that page up again. Okay, doing good with the typos today. So in our threads show, so extends layout. Okay, here we go. So we've got our Create a Freelance Platform job messages. It's got the description there. No messages currently found. I've noticed another thing. We have forgot to put a submit button on our Create a Message form. Good thing that's an easy fix. So form, submit, send message. There we go, send message button. A test message, hit send, message saved, and you can see here we've got Freelancer and we've got a test message. So if we log in as our client, we should be able to respond to that message. So client, log in, my jobs. Here we've got the same job. Okay, one thing we need to do as well that I didn't think about is on the My Jobs, we set this to just go to the Edit Job screen. So we probably need to change that so that we can just view the job instead. So that's going to be quite simple. So it's on our Jobs show page or our index page here. And here we've got the edit. We just need to remove that edit. And we'll just need to add an edit button somewhere else. So if I reload this page now. Okay, so now we're logged in as our client. We've got our same job here in the My Jobs page. If we go into the job, you can see we've got participants here, our freelancer and our client. Now, these aren't very descriptive. These are the names we actually set up to track them. In most cases, this would actually be somebody's real name, and this would be the client's name. And we can go view conversation, and we can see here message from our freelancer, and we can reply, thanks for the message. Okay, message saved. So we can have a full conversation now about this particular job. So as far as functionality goes, I guess we're pretty much there. So our clients can log in and they can post a job. Our freelancers can come in and view the jobs. They can save them as favorites in their sidebar. They can send a message to the client to talk about the job. And our clients can now come in and view and respond to these messages. So they can have a full conversation and organise to have the job completed for them as they go. In a real life scenario, you'd probably want to be able to close the job, provide some sort of a contract between the client and the freelancer, organise payments, things like that. But I think this is a good starting point, especially if you haven't used Laravel before. It sort of explains a lot of the concepts like relationships and the way to set things up and get going in Laravel. And I think this is a good platform for you to now build on that, and you can quite easily modify the models and add functionality as you go. So we've discussed a lot of the details of how to stitch things together in Laravel with some practical examples. And I think that's the most important part. So that's going to be it for the end of this session. In the next session, we'll have a look at how we can publish this onto the web. So actually set it up on a server and set it up so that you can actually publish this using Git deploys and things like that. So thanks for tuning in, and I will see you in the next session. Okay. Now that we've got a fully functioning app, or a starting point for our fully functioning app, we want to be able to publish this and make it available online. Now this is obviously a process that you need to get right, and quite often this process in itself scares people off from even starting a project, but it shouldn't be that way. So Laravel has actually created a service called Forge, and Laravel Forge, which is available at forge.laravel.com. Makes it really simple to actually deploy your project, your Laravel project, to DigitalOcean and a few other providers like Linode and Amazon Web Services and things like that. You can check out the website and the documentation yourself, but it makes it really simple, really simple to publish your project. So if we go ahead and log in, I've already got an account with Forge, and I've got a few projects already running on a server I've set up. Now you can only create one server with Laravel Forge on the base package, which is what I've got. So I've already got it set up here. It's for your server, and Forge will actually set your server up so that it runs Laravel super quickly. So what I'm going to do is let's first create a database within Forge to handle our application. I'm just going to call it Freelance, and I'll add a database. We don't really need to do anything else here except create the database, and you can see here it is Freelance and it's installing. And we can go in and go to our sites. And what we want to do is set a domain for our site. So you can either purchase a domain. I'm just going to make a subdomain on my website called freelance.busyit.com.au. Project type will be general PHP and Laravel, and the web directory will be /public, because we know that our Laravel project is actually served from that public directory. So hit submit, and we're now installing or setting up our freelance.busyit.com.au site, and you can see it lets us set up by directory. So hit submit, and we're now installing or setting up our freelance.busyit.com.au site, and you can see it lets us set up by Git repository, or you can start an empty WordPress installation. One thing I will do before I go any further is look at our environment file. So on our local machine, this is where we set up our development environment, including databases and things. It's not going to let us do it at the moment. That's fine. We can have a look at that in a sec. Okay, so we can install from a Git repository, which is pretty cool. So we've set up Git already. We haven't committed in a while because I've been recording these videos, but that's fine. So if I just add all our new files to the Git repository and just do a refresh here, I can commit my changes. And I can now push to our origin. So this is going to update our Git repository on GitHub, so you guys now have access to the full project in its current form. And we can actually access it from here as well. So by hooking up our GitHub account through Forge, I think that's what I call it. Let me just double check. So GitHub. Freelance Hub. Yep. Branch master. We also want to install our composer dependencies. So everything that is in our vendor directory will also come with us because we haven't installed that on the server. So it makes it really simple. We can just hit install. Don't have permission to access it. I'm pretty sure I do. I wrote it. Freelance Hub. Okay, don't put the slash in front. So this is installing our repository. The other thing I've got to do is point this subdomain, so freelance.busyit.com.au, to this address, and I've also got to set it up in DigitalOcean. So I use Google's cloud services for a couple of other projects, and I've actually got my website set up to use Cloud DNS through here. So let me find this quickly. Yours may be different if you're using a domain host or whatever for DNS, but let's go in here and create a subdomain. So here you can see I've got a couple already pointing to DigitalOcean. So they're going to be pretty much exactly the same. So I'll add a record set. It will be Freelance. I'll call it Freelance or Freelance Hub. Freelance.busyit.com.au. We're going to make name server entry s1.digitalocean.com, s2.digitalocean.com, and s3.digitalocean.com. If I create that on my DNS, so that's going to tell us to go to the DigitalOcean's name server. So I need to tell DigitalOcean how to handle any traffic that it gets from us. So I've got a server set up with DigitalOcean through Forge. And we'll access now. Oh. Invalid. Normally, let me just log in. Maybe I did it with Google. Try that one. That's got it. So within DigitalOcean, I need to have a look at my domains. So it'll be networking domains, add a domain. So it's going to be freelance.busyit.com.au. It's going to be the server BusyComs, which I've set up, so I can add the domain. Okay, so I've got that set. Okay, create those records, and hopefully that's going to point us all the way through now. So deployment has completed on our Forge site. So we now need to edit our environment file and set the correct database. So we set the database as Freelance. So the app name is going to be Freelance Hub. It's production environment, debugging's off. So we need to set our database to Freelance. Okay, once that's done, we need to go back into this app and we need to deploy again so that it runs the database migrations again for us. So that's deploying now. Let's see if our site will load. freelance.busyit.com.au. Okay, so environment file is invalid. So it's actually pointing in the right place, which is fantastic. But if we go back into our environment file, you can't put spaces in without quoting the text. And I do this every time. Hit save. Okay, now that we've set our environment file, we're going to have to deploy again to basically change our database and migrate our new database. So we've got PHP Artisan migrate already in our deploy script here, but I need to add in here Artisan DB seed, and we need to use the force flag. Now this isn't really a smart idea. We'll only do this on the first deploy, and then we'll remove this script. So we'll hit deploy now, and this should build our new database for us. Still deploying. Okay, so refreshing the page, we've now got our roles in here, and we should be able to sign up as a client. So let's just try this. Okay, so we're logged in as a client. We should be able to post jobs and do everything that we expected. One thing you'll notice though is if we log out, we've still got this basic Laravel screen. We don't really want this. This is somewhere where you really want to get people into your app. So let's have a look at how deploying via Git can really help us. So I've removed the database seeding in here. Just one was asking me to save again. Okay. So we're updating via Git, and by setting the quick deploy, we should be able to deploy straight from our code editor. So if we go back to Coda, get rid of that. Let's have a look at our welcome.blade. So the welcome.blade is essentially the home page. You can see they've got the title of Laravel. So let's call that Freelance Hub. We don't really want these links here. Okay, but I might want to put in a bit of a paragraph that says sign up or log in to view or post jobs. Now you would probably want to put a list of jobs on this page so that it's not quite so boring. If we log out now, this is our local environment, sorry. And it's going to tell me that it's broken. Oh, there we go. So Freelance Hub, sign up or log into view. So we want to push this to our live site now. So you'll see in our source control, we've got our welcome.blade and it's telling us it's changed, so we can commit that. So we can say homepage update, commit, push that to our origin. And what you'll notice is if you look at Forge really quick, it's got deploying for us already. It's pretty cool. So when that comes green again, active, let's refresh our site. There we go. So we've actually managed a change on our live site directly from our code editor, and we've just pushed it using Git. And it's really quite powerful. Once you hook up with Forge, you can make all the changes to your application, including migrations. So if you have to change something in your database, it'll all update when you push it. That's the advantage of migrations. Back in the past, before Laravel, and I'm sure even early in Laravel's life, before migrations, you would edit your code and then you'd have to go back and then sort of edit your database on the live server before you uploaded the new code, which is pretty scary and pretty dangerous. So with migrations, we can do it all automatically and it just works. I hope this series has helped you with the basics of Laravel and the way you can use relationships to make some pretty powerful little tools. This has been a very basic implementation of a freelancing site, and I hope that it's given you some ideas to extend this and change the models up a bit, maybe make the messaging a bit more powerful. You can style it. I haven't really done any styling, but using Bootstrap, you can do you can make it look pretty nice, pretty quick. But I guess that's it for the series, and I've uploaded all of this to Git. We've just pushed the live code just as we changed this title. So feel free to download it, have a play with it, extend it, do whatever you like with it, and I hope it inspires you to have a little bit of a closer look at Laravel if you haven't used it before, and just give it a shot. I mean, you never know what you can create.